Testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode is Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon, and the subtitle is The Key to Unlocking Book of Mormon Apologetics. Well, as a lot of you know, I'm very, very much a fan of Shakespeare. In fact, I started my own podcast on Shakespeare, and it's called Brush Up Your Shakespeare. It started in January of this year, by the way. For the record, today's date is November 8th, 2024. It is a Friday morning when I am recording this. So when I say earlier this year, I mean in January of 2024. I started with Hamlet. I went through the entire play of Hamlet in a number of episodes. So I'm very, very involved in Shakespeare. Now, on the other hand, I'm also very involved in Mormonism and in the Book of Mormon, which I have read many, many, many times, over 20, maybe even closer to 30 times by this point. After 20, you start losing track, and at least I did. So what we have here is a natural, because there is a long-standing chestnut of an argument against the Book of Mormon, or a criticism of the Book of Mormon that's been around for a long time. And that argument is that the Book of Mormon quotes Shakespeare. Now, I'm not saying that the Book of Mormon does quote Shakespeare. I'm saying that's the argument that we're going to be looking at today. So that's, of course, a natural for me, Radio Free Mormon, to look at. And yet, it never occurred to me until a listener brought it up to me in a direct message on Facebook saying, why don't you do this thing about Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon? Since you love Shakespeare, you love the Book of Mormon, what could be more natural, right? What could be more natural? So I thought, yes, I will. And on top of that, I've looked at it, and I've looked at it deeply. And I've come up with a number of observations, I think about 7 observations regarding this particular subject. And on top of that, what's going to make this really important and really exciting, I think, is that I'm going to use this example as a means of introducing you to a new line of argumentation that I have come up with regarding an old Book of Mormon apologetic, which is resurfacing now in these last days of podcasting. And that old line of argumentation for the Book of Mormon is to look at apocryphal texts, pseudepigraphical texts, extra biblical texts, in other words, and then find parallels between what is in those texts and the Book of Mormon as a means of proving by the apologists that the Book of Mormon is true. So what this is going to do, this line of argumentation that I'm going to be introducing by means of this podcast and using Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon as an example, is going to, I think, have the capacity to completely or almost completely undermine that line of apologetic argumentation for the Book of Mormon by looking at parallels or similarities between extra biblical texts and finding matches in the Book of Mormon. Now, I do want to say that it's not just the Book of Mormon where this goes on. It also goes on with ancient texts and the Doctrine and Covenants, or ancient texts and something that Joseph Smith taught, or ancient texts and the way the church is organized. It's all those kind of things. But I just want to say, with the Book of Mormon as shorthand for all the other kinds of ways in which this type of argumentation from extra biblical ancient texts comes from and applies to. All right, now I've said that much, and there's one other thing that I want to say. And the other thing that I want to say is, I had it in my mind just a second ago. By the way, I'm also trying to not edit as much, which makes this a little bit rougher, but hopefully maybe even a little bit more real, more immediate. I can be a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more natural than I am sometimes with all of the editing that I frequently do, or have been known to do, at least in the past, for Radio Free Mormon. So let me see here. Now, this line of argumentation, or this methodology that I have recently come up with and that I'll be introducing here in this show at the end, and using this as an example for, right, Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon, is something that I've talked to Bill Reel about. He's very excited about it. I'm excited about it. This is just going to be an introduction. Bill Reel and I are planning on doing an entire Mormonism live show on this subject sometime in the near future, hopefully by the end of the year. There's a great deal to say about this. And For me, at least, it was a little bit difficult to put it into words that hopefully will make it clear the concepts I'm talking about. I've worked hard on that to try and make it clear. It's something that may not be clear at first, but once you see it, it's one of those kind of things, right? Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It is so obvious. I can't believe that I didn't realize this before, because I'm one of those people, right, who, when I was an active, faithful Mormon and an apologist for the LDS Church, I spent years and years reading through apocryphal literature to find connections between it and the Book of Mormon. I spent years reading through pseudepigraphical literature to find connections between it and the Book of Mormon. So I've been there, I've done that. So I know how the game is played. And now I think I can come up with a methodology to show you why that game doesn't mean anything. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't show anything. And that's what we'll get to today as we proceed. First off, let's go to our slide, shall we? And there is our title slide, Is Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon? All right, now this argument, as I said, is an old chestnut. It's been around for a long time. It goes back at least to this book by Sidney B. Sperry, which I've referenced before. It's titled The Problems of the Book of Mormon. I have it right here. It's from 1964, so that is 60 years ago, and it's been around since before then. And this is one of the several problems in the Book of Mormon that Sidney B. Sperry seeks to address and hopefully try and resolve from a faithful perspective. He was a professor at BYU. The Sidney Sperry Symposium was created and named after him. And if you know what that is, then you know what it is. But very famous professor, very faithful professor, and a professor who tried to make the Book of Mormon and Mormonism defensible by the average member. So here we have the page in it. It's chapter 14, if I can remember my Roman numerals. Does the Book of Mormon quote Shakespeare? And at the very beginning, you can see how old it is, this argument, because he says Joseph Smith has been charged by many of his critics as being an impostor and an ignoramus, but strange to say, some of them, such as Alexander Campbell, John Hyde, M.T. Lamb, W.A. Lynn, and others, claim that he quotes words of Shakespeare in a passage of the Book of Mormon. Now, if you're going back to Alexander Campbell, that's in the 1830s. That's when the Book of Mormon came out. And so this argument has been around since the beginning, apparently. We're not going to go through what Sidney Sperry has to say about it. We're going to go to Fair Mormon ultimately. But first, let's see what the issue is about and what the language is in Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1, that critics think is being quoted in the Book of Mormon. It's from the to be or not to be speech, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. I put the first line in there just to give you grounding, as that's the soliloquy. And then it goes on later to say, who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death. And now I've highlighted it in red because this is the salient part of the quote. After death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. And then it goes on, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. So that's it, death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. That is the passage in question. If we look in 2 Nephi chapter 1, verse 14, we find Lehi talking to his children not long before Lehi passes away. And what he says is this: awake and arise from the dust, and hear the words of a trembling parent, whose limbs ye must soon lay down in the cold and silent grave. And now I've got this highlighted in red, right? The cold and silent grave, from whence no traveler can return. A few more days, and I go the way of all the earth. So if we put those two passages side by side, Hamlet on the left, Book of Mormon on the right, we can see that what we have really is death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. That's from Hamlet. And from the Book of Mormon, the cold and silent grave, from whence no traveler can return. So there's certainly similarities in it, and we're going to talk a little bit about those similarities. It's a very brief passage. It's just a clause. It's not even an entire sentence in either Shakespeare or in the Book of Mormon. but the idea is obviously the same, regardless of the language. So, observation number one on these two passages: this is not a direct quotation from Hamlet. Although it is similar, it is not exact. We have to make that observation right off the bat. This is not something where Joseph Smith either has the soliloquy or this passage from the soliloquy memorized and it shows up in the Book of Mormon. It's not that he has Hamlet in front of him, open to Act 3, Scene 1, when he is dictating this part of the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi chapter 1. So, like he has the Bible apparently in front of him when he's dictating certain passages from the Book of Mormon, which are almost word for word passages from the King James Version of the Bible. So this is not a direct quotation from Hamlet. Although it is similar, it is not exact. That's the first concession that must be made. What do apologists have to say about the similarity between the Book of Mormon and Shakespeare here? This is from the Fair Mormon website. This is where I told you I'd go to somewhere else other than Sidney Sperry to talk about this. What do the apologists say? This is on their website at Fair Mormon even today. So they quote from Hamlet, that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Then in the next part of this graph or chart, they quote from the Book of Mormon, just as we did. But in the third part, they have other similar phrases. They have something from Charles Dickens, The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. We're going to skip that for now. We'll come back to this quote because it doesn't really make that much sense that they'd be quoting from Charles Dickens here, because this book in which he quotes Shakespeare didn't come out until 1838 and 1839, 8 to 9 years after the Book of Mormon came off the press in 1830. As I say, we'll come back to that. But they do have two quotes beneath that for comparison purposes from the book of Job. The first quote being Job chapter 10, verses 20 through 21, which is quoted as follows: "Let me alone, that I may take comfort a little, before I go whence I shall not return, even to the land of darkness and the shadow of death." So we have the same kind of idea. You've got whence, you've got return in it. Yep. And then another passage from Job, this one from chapter 16, verse 22. "When a few years are come, then I shall go to the way whence I shall not return." All right, so you've got whence and return in both those quotes from Job, which do line up with Book of Mormon, whence and return in 2 Nephi chapter 1, verse 14. And down at the bottom of this chart, they call it a table, table 1. They state, "Thus, if we have sources that predate Lehi's departure from Jerusalem, such as Job," by the way, that is a huge question already. Even Sidney B. Sperry mentions that in his article. Many, if not most, Bible scholars date Job to after the time that Lehi left Jerusalem. They put it in the time of the Babylonian captivity, which actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it and what the message of Job is, that he has everything taken from him: his wife, his lands, his children, all of his property, his herds. And on top of that, he has these horrible physical afflictions. And yet he remains faithful. This seems to really fit as an allegory to be taught to the Israelites when they have been taken out of their homeland, their temple destroyed, and taken into another country, Babylonia, or Babylon, the Neo-Babylonian Empire at the time. It really does fit in there because at the end, of course, the idea is if you remain faithful in spite of all this horrible stuff that's happening to you, if you remain faithful, God will restore it all to you again, which is what happens to Job at the end of the book. So that's the first problem, is that we don't know exactly when Job was written, but we do know that lots and lots of very, very prominent Bible scholars date it to after the time that Lehi left Jerusalem. So this first line in this article from Fair Mormon is already suspect. Thus, it goes on, or thus it starts. I'm going to read it again from the beginning. "Thus, if we have sources that predate Lehi's departure from Jerusalem, such as Job," that's a big if, okay? That's not a fact. That's an if. That's a supposition. That's a prayer by the people who are writing this, actually, "which he could have plausibly drawn from," i.e. Lehi, "for his homily to his sons." In other words, they're saying, Well, Job was on the brass plates. And Lehi is just drawing from Job, and he's quoting Job. He's not quoting Shakespeare here, right? That's the whole point, but it only works if Job had been written before 600 BCE, right? And therefore could have been on the brass plates that Lehi took with him and his family into the wilderness. How can one validly claim that the only potential source for the similar verbiage would be Joseph Smith plagiarizing Shakespeare? Well, I will tell you, I'm not sure that anybody, of course, I haven't read all of these critics. I will certainly say that I don't know anybody who would rationally or reasonably claim that the only potential source for the similar verbiage would be Joseph Smith plagiarizing Shakespeare. It's certainly similar, but it's not necessarily the only source. That almost sounds like a straw man, that they're straw manning the other side's argument to make it easier to defeat. Let's go on to the next observation, shall we? Although the Book of Mormon phrase is not exact, it is closer to Shakespeare than it is to Job. Why? One word, and that one word is traveler. The side-by-side comparison again with traveler underlined. Remember, Hamlet says, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. And 2 Nephi 1:14 uses the same word, traveler, which is not used in Job, by the way. The cold and silent grave from whence no traveler can return. That is significant. And the reason it's significant is because traveler is a word that is used once in the Book of Mormon. That's my observation number 3. According to my search of the Book of Mormon at the church's official website, where you can put in words to search the scriptures or the Book of Mormon, the word traveler occurs only once in the Book of Mormon, which strengthens the possibility of its being taken from Shakespeare. In other words, if traveler were used several times or throughout the Book of Mormon, then it wouldn't be so remarkable that it's used here in this one place in 2 Nephi chapter 1, verse 14, as well as in the passage from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. That's significant. Does it mean that Joseph Smith was definitely quoting Shakespeare? No, but it makes it more likely. How much more likely is up to you to decide, but I think it's indisputable that it makes it more likely to have been taken from Shakespeare or been influenced by Shakespeare. Observation number 4. Once again, it is not an exact quote from Shakespeare. We've already remarked on that. But does this mean that Shakespeare was not the source? Sometimes the apologists will get excited and say, well, it's not an exact quote, therefore Shakespeare could not have been the source. Well, the question I'm asking is, just because it's an exact quote from Shakespeare, does that mean that Shakespeare was not the source? No, it doesn't mean that. I mean, how many times have I misquoted Shakespeare? I have memorized long passages, soliloquies, little snippets, all sorts of Shakespeare throughout my life. And yet, when it comes time to recite Shakespeare, I am just as likely to miss a word as anybody else. So even though I am quoting Shakespeare, right, I'm getting words wrong. Therefore, the fact that somebody gets words wrong when they're quoting Shakespeare doesn't mean that Shakespeare's not the source. It just means that they're quoting him wrong. And the same thing could be happening in the Book of Mormon. It's not quoted exactly, it's just quoted wrong, but still Shakespeare is the ultimate source. And not only I misquote Shakespeare, but very famous actors misquote Shakespeare, even in productions of Shakespeare and even in filmed productions of Shakespeare, where they could go back and redo the scene if somebody noticed. It was about 10 years or so ago that I was watching Patrick Stewart perform in Macbeth. It's filmed, you can get it, you can watch it. I recommend it, actually. I've never really been that impressed with Patrick Stewart as an actor. And I apologize for those of you who are big Patrick Stewart fans. He just seems rather flat and uninteresting to me. However, I changed my mind with his performance of Macbeth. He may have given the best, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" soliloquy of anybody ever. It's incredible. It's wonderful what he does with that. So I want to give him credit for that. However, when I was watching it 10 years ago, there was a place where he messed a word up in one of his soliloquies. Now, I can't remember which one it was. And it wasn't a big word, it was a small word, right? And those are the most likely for a person such as myself and apparently Patrick Stewart to goof up. Now, immediately I thought the problem's with me, surely, because I must be misremembering it. He's got it right. I mean, he would know if he messed it up. The director would know if he messed it up. The person with the script over there by the side would know that he messed it up. And if he messed it up, they would go back and reshoot it, right? No. So I went and checked my copy of Macbeth and found out that actually I did remember it correctly. He'd goofed up one word. It didn't make any difference. All I'm saying is that even a famous actor, Shakespearean actor such as Patrick Stewart, can goof up lines from Shakespeare. It's not unheard of. It's actually very common. A more incredible example of this is Michael Caine. Michael Caine is a fabulous actor. He's not particularly known for his Shakespearean parts, but there is a video on YouTube of his reciting the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. And I remember a number of months ago, it could be up to a year ago, it came up in my feed and I watched it and I was shocked that he made a stupendous error in it and that it was left in. Let me tell you what I mean. If by Rudyard Kipling, hopefully you've heard of this before. This is just the final stanza. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much. Now here's the place where he goofed it up. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, and you notice I put the with 60 seconds in red letters to highlight it. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. That's how it ends, right? Now, if you'll look at this, I have this part, just the last part of Michael Caine reciting. He's not reading it. It's obvious to me he's not reading it. I saw him in a different video where he was actually looking at the camera and reciting it. This one, I couldn't find that one, but this one has the same recitation, but with pictures and video of other things on the screen while he's reciting. So here it is. And see if you notice a difference.
If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 40 seconds worth of distance run,
40?
yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son.
Absolutely incredible. I love Michael Caine. He's a wonderful actor. I love the way he recites this poem. But honestly, that makes no sense. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, of course that's the line. But for some reason, he says 40 seconds. It gets left in, and now it's part of this video, and it's part of other videos too. This isn't the only one on YouTube. This particular one has actually millions of views. It's around 8 million, 9 million views. And everybody who's watching this is seeing Michael Caine say 40 seconds worth of fill the unforgiving minute with 40 seconds worth of distance run. It's funny because it's completely the opposite of the entire tenor of this poem. But there you have it. And once again, this isn't a diss on Michael Caine. I love Michael Caine. You probably love him too. All I'm doing is to show that just because somebody misquotes a poem or a line doesn't mean that he wasn't quoting or attempting to quote If by Rudyard Kipling. Yes, he's reciting Rudyard Kipling. Just because he goofs up a line doesn't mean that he's not reciting from Rudyard Kipling and that Rudyard Kipling is not the influence and the source. In the same way, all I'm saying is that if Joseph Smith were referencing Hamlet as he got to this point in the Book of Mormon, just because he got the quote wrong doesn't mean that Hamlet wasn't the source. Okay, I think I've made that point. Let's go on from there, shall we? Oh, I want to make that point a little bit more, just to have some fun if we can. Also, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Now, this was published in 1885. It's the same century as the Book of Mormon. It's about 55 years later or so that it comes off the press. Now, in this book, Huckleberry Finn, it features a pair of con men who are known as the King and the Duke, sometimes the King and the Dauphin, but the King and the Duke, one of whom sets forth to recite Hamlet's soliloquy and makes an absolute botch of it, getting some things right, other things wrong, some from different places in Hamlet, other lines from Macbeth, and even Richard III. But nobody in the group, right? It's Huckleberry, it's Jim, it's the King and the Duke. They're in the group, right? As they're going down the river. Nobody has an actual copy of the play Hamlet, so they can't check against it. So nobody's the wiser that this is a very different soliloquy than what is written by Shakespeare, and yet it's recognizable as coming from Hamlet or attempting to come from Hamlet. And yet with certain elements that make it clear Hamlet is the original source. I'm not going to give you the whole thing, just the first few lines so you can see what it is I'm talking about. It starts off, of course, to be or not to be, but then it starts straying. That is the bare bodkin, right? Bare bodkin being a line that comes later on in the same soliloquy. That makes calamity of so long life. Same thing. By the way, it's not just a hodgepodge. It's done very cleverly by Mark Twain in such a way as that it actually kind of makes sense. Although it's not the original sense it was supposed to make, putting these lines in from different places from Shakespeare actually ends up making a different kind of sense. And it's a very funny kind of sense. To be or not to be, that is the bare bodkin that makes calamity of so long life. For who would fardels bear? So far, all of that is from the same soliloquy, Act 3, Scene 1. But then it shifts to, till Burnham wood do come to Dunsinane. Of course, that's Macbeth, right? Shifting back to Hamlet, but that the fear of something after death murders the innocent sleep. Segueing once again to Macbeth. Great nature's second course, Macbeth, and makes us rather sling the arrows of outrageous fortune. That's the same Hamlet soliloquy, changed around a little bit. Then fly to others that we know not of. And it continues like that in a similar vein all the way to the end. And it's after that that they throw in at least one line from Richard III. Okay. Now I think that I have made the point clear that just because you don't get the quote right doesn't mean that Hamlet is not the source. Okay. Same for Huckleberry Finn, same for Michael Caine, same for Patrick Stewart, same for me, same for the Book of Mormon. Okay. Next slide. Oh, so the fact the words in the Book of Mormon are not exactly the same as in Hamlet does little to dispel the notion that Shakespeare is a possible source. Notice I'm not making the argument that Shakespeare is the only source. That's the straw man that the good people at Fair Mormon tried to create. I'm saying that Shakespeare is a possible source, and the fact that the quote is not exactly the same doesn't really do much to change the possibility. It doesn't move the needle on the possibility that Shakespeare is the source. Okay. Observation number 5. The Shakespeare quote we are talking about is from the most famous play in the English language. And not only that, the Shakespeare quote we're talking about is from the most famous soliloquy in the English language. The undiscovered country from which no traveler returns has a certain ring to it. So we're not talking about Troilus and Cressida. We're not talking about Titus Andronicus. Even if it's Hamlet, we're not talking about some line that nobody really knows or uses outside of Shakespearean actors. We're talking about a very famous line in a very famous soliloquy in a very famous play. And I'm not saying that Joseph Smith had read Hamlet. I mean, how many people out there know To Be or Not to Be is from Hamlet, and they've never read Hamlet? They may never have even seen Hamlet. These are things that are repeated so much that they are in our culture, they're in the air, and people simply know them through repeated usage, and they hear about it. In a similar way, it's quite likely, it's quite possible, let's put it that way, it's completely possible that Joseph Smith had heard this line from Hamlet about death being the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, and it ends up showing up in the Book of Mormon in the words of Lehi. But as I say, this undiscovered country idea from Hamlet has a certain ring to it, and it gets used in a lot of different ways. Here's one. Star Trek VI, what was the name of it? It's right there on the screen. The Undiscovered Country. Where do you think that comes from? It's not the Book of Mormon. It's from Shakespeare. So it's a very famous expression, and it's completely possible that without Joseph Smith having read Shakespeare, without his having attended Shakespeare, that it could show up in the Book of Mormon and still be influenced by Shakespeare. That's the point of that observation. Observation number 6, strengthening the idea that this phrase comes from somewhere outside the Book of Mormon is that this concept is not something we would expect Lehi to be saying. This is important and I think fascinating. In other words, why would Lehi characterize the grave as something from which no traveler can return? Does Lehi not believe in the resurrection? Remember Alma chapter 40, this was a seminary scripture. When I wasn't in seminary, but at the time when I would have been in seminary, it was a seminary scripture. I being baptized right after I graduated from high school. Alma 40, right? The dead shall come forth and be reunited, both soul and body, and be brought to stand before God. That's Alma chapter 40, verse 21. It goes on in verse 23. The soul shall be restored to the body, and the body to the soul. Yea, and every limb and joint shall be restored to its body. Yea, even a hair of the head shall not be lost, but all things shall be restored to their proper and perfect frame. Yeah, that's the resurrection scripture. That's the restoration and resurrection scripture from the Book of Mormon. We all know this, right? But then I thought, well, did Lehi, obviously Lehi wasn't around in the time of Alma. Did Lehi know about the resurrection? Did Lehi believe in the resurrection? Yes, Lehi believed in the resurrection. How do we know? Because in the very next chapter, after the maybe quote from Hamlet, he goes into a long sermon in the form of a blessing to his son Jacob. And this is the one that talks about opposition in all things, right? Before he gets to the opposition in all things part, he has this to say in verses 8 and 10. Wherefore, how great the importance to make these things known unto the inhabitants of the earth, that they may know that there is no flesh that can dwell in the presence of God, save it be through the merits and mercy and grace of the Holy Messiah, who layeth down his life according to the flesh and taketh it again by the power of the Spirit. Why does he do all of that? Answer, that he may bring to pass the resurrection of the dead, being the first that should rise. And then in verse 10, he goes on, and because of the intercession for all men come unto God. Wherefore they stand in the presence of him to be judged of him according to the truth and holiness which is in him. So the question is, if Lehi believes in the resurrection, as he obviously is portrayed in the Book of Mormon as believing, why does he say that the grave is a place from which no man returns? When in the very next chapter, he's saying every man returns from the grave. They come unto God to be judged of God according to their works, right? Okay, that is observation number 6 continued, right? The idea that the grave is something from which no traveler can return is completely foreign to the entire Book of Mormon, Alma as well as Lehi. It is even completely foreign to Lehi's own sermon he gives in the chapter immediately following. This increases the possibility. I'm still not saying it's proven. I'm just saying it increases the possibility that this phrase was borrowed from somewhere else. Because even as Sidney B. Sperry says in his article, this expression sticks out like a sore thumb in the Book of Mormon. When he says that, he's actually talking, I think, about the use of the word traveler, which we've already covered. But this makes it stick out even more. It is doctrinally out of place in the Book of Mormon. It contradicts all the doctrine on the subject everywhere else in the Book of Mormon. So why is Lehi suddenly saying something that's 180 degrees opposite from what he says in the next chapter about people coming back from the grave if it belonged in the Book of Mormon originally? It sounds and feels and looks like something that was taken from somewhere else, some other source, and planted in the Book of Mormon for dramatic effect, for a rhetorical flourish. I'm not sure which, but I am saying that the fact it seems foreign, it's a foreign concept in the Book of Mormon, increases the possibility that this phrase was borrowed from somewhere else, and that somewhere else may have been Shakespeare. It could have been Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. Once again, we're going back to what do the apologists say? Now, here, I just want to once again emphasize the fact that the two quotes that are being given here are from the book of Job. It is a similar concept, isn't it? Now, the one from the Book of Mormon, having traveler in it, is much similar. I think a lot more similar to the quote in Hamlet than the quotes in Job, because traveler is such an unusual word. It's an unusual word. It's a unique word here, apparently, in the Book of Mormon. And yet it matches up with what is in Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. But nevertheless, let's talk about Job. Why does Job say similar ideas about the grave or death being a place from which no one can return? Obviously, that's what Job is saying here in these two passages from Job 10 and Job 16. Let's look into that, shall we? Why does Job use such expressions? Short answer: because this was the common Jewish belief prior to the Second Temple period commencing around 500 BCE. This is what Jewish people commonly believed, that the grave was a place that you went from which you did not return. There was no resurrection. Many Jews continued to believe this at the time of Jesus, although many other Jewish people had adopted the idea of the resurrection from different cultures and different sources, okay? Because, of course, they're being conquered periodically throughout history. They are being placed under other cultures, under other kingdoms, and they are imbibing their mythology, their religion, and taking their concepts, some of their concepts, and adapting them or introducing them into Judaism. So, even though this was the common Jewish belief prior to the Second Temple period around 500 BCE, in the 500 years after that and before Jesus, many Jews continued to believe this at the time of Jesus. That's when things changed, which is why the Sadducees, who did not believe in the resurrection, right? And the Pharisees, who did believe in the resurrection, famously had a New Testament argument over the resurrection of the dead. That's a story where Paul's getting into trouble with both of them. He brings up the resurrection of the dead and says, this is why I'm being brought to judgment, is because I teach the resurrection of the dead. And with that tactic, he got the Pharisees to argue with the Sadducees and the Sadducees to argue with the Pharisees. And he was able to sneak out the door while they were fighting each other and escape. That's the basic gist of that story. But that's why there were two factions at the time of Jesus. One who maintained the traditional Jewish belief that there was no resurrection, and that was the Sadducees. And the Pharisees, who maintained the newer Jewish belief that there was a resurrection. Going to the next slide, we need to talk just a little bit about Sheol. All right? Sheol is the grave. It is death. It is the afterlife. It is the word that is used in Hebrew to talk about death. And this is from the Wikipedia article, which gives some helpful information. Sheol in the Hebrew Bible, it's what's called the Old Testament, is the underworld place of stillness and darkness which lies after death. That's what Sheol is. Within the Hebrew Bible, there are few, often brief and nondescript, mentions of Sheol, seemingly describing it as a place where both the righteous and the unrighteous dead go. Everybody goes there, righteous or unrighteous. It doesn't make any difference, regardless of their moral choices in life. The implications of Sheol within the text are therefore somewhat unclear. It may be interpreted as either a generic metaphor describing the grave into which all humans invariably descend, or an actual state of afterlife within Israelite thought. Though such practices are forbidden, the inhabitants of Sheol can, under some circumstances, be summoned by the living, as when the witch of Endor calls up the spirit of Samuel for King Saul. We remember that story, don't we? Now, Sheol and Hades, because when you read that description of Sheol, it sounds kind of like the Greek version of the afterlife, which is Hades, right? There is a connection. While the Hebrew Bible appears to describe Sheol as the permanent place of the dead, in the Second Temple period, roughly 500 BCE to 70 CE, a more diverse set of ideas developed. In some texts, Sheol is considered to be the home of both the righteous and the wicked, like it said before, separated into respective compartments, though. In others, it was considered a place of punishment, meant for the wicked dead alone. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, that's the Septuagint, in ancient Alexandria around 200 BCE, the word Hades, remember they're translating the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, what we would call it, into Greek, from Hebrew to Greek. So the Hebrew Sheol was translated into Hades in the Septuagint. The word Hades, the Greek underworld, was substituted for Sheol, owing to its similarities to the underworld of Greek mythology. The gloss of Sheol as Hades is reflected in the New Testament, where Hades is both the underworld of the dead and the personification of the evil it represents, i.e., Hades is not only the place, it's also the person who rules over the place. Hades, the individual, the god. Now, there's a reason we're talking about Sheol and Hades. Remember, we're asking the question, why does Job talk about death or the grave as being a place from which nobody returns? The answer is because that's his belief. That was the common belief of Jewish people at the time. Sheol in the book of Job. Sheol is mentioned 66 times throughout the Hebrew Bible. The first mention of Sheol within the text associated with the state of death and a sense of eternal finality. Jacob in the Old Testament, Jacob avows that he will go down to Sheol, still mourning the apparent death of his son Joseph. Later on, the same formula is repeated when describing the sorrow that would befall Jacob should another of his sons, Benjamin, not return to Israel with his remaining brothers. I skipped a little bit of the article and come down to this important point. The remaining mentions of Sheol lie in the poetic literature of the Hebrew Bible. Job mentions Sheol in several of his laments, calling it his home as he lies in anguish, and yearning for death to take him there to put an end to his suffering. Sheol is also mentioned in several Psalms, again, as the grave of humanity. So you might wonder, why is Job talking about the grave as a place from which nobody returns? It's because that's what the Jewish people believed at the time, okay? It makes absolute sense historically. So why would Lehi quote Job? Ironically, remember, that's what the apologists are saying in that one chart or that one table that we've been looking at. They're suggesting that Lehi quoted Job as opposed to Shakespeare. Why would Lehi quote Job? Ironically, such a quote would be consistent. It would be consistent with ancient Jewish belief if Lehi had been a real Jewish person really living around 600 BCE. That would make absolute sense for him to say what he says in 2 Nephi chapter 1, verse 14, right? The problem is that the Book of Mormon presents Lehi as a thoroughly Christianized Jew who would not agree with Job's sentiments in this regard. And we know that because of the sermon he gives immediately afterward in the next chapter, 2 Nephi 2, right? We've been over that. The resurrection or return from the grave is a foundational tenet of Christianity. And this Christian belief, this Christian tenet, is reflected throughout the Book of Mormon, including in Lehi's own words in the next chapter. So Lehi wouldn't be quoting Job, because if he did, it would contradict his own beliefs about the resurrection. Observation number 7. Lehi's quote is closer to Hamlet than it is to Job. Remember the word traveler, we've been over that. Number 2, Lehi's quote contains doctrine foreign to the rest of the Book of Mormon, but right at home in Job. And we've talked about that as well. 3, although it should be noted that the same quote is out of place in Hamlet as well as in the Book of Mormon. I had to throw this in just to be frank with you and to consider all the different perspectives that I can see, at least. Why is it just as out of place in Hamlet, this quote, as it is in the Book of Mormon? Because the plot of Hamlet centers around Hamlet's father returning from the grave as a ghost. So much for not returning from death, right? So that quote about death being the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns doesn't make any sense in Hamlet for Hamlet to be saying it when it's the middle of the play and the ghost has already appeared to him to tell him to avenge his murder. That's what the whole play is about. So I have to say that this quote fits in the Book of Mormon just as badly as it fits in the context of the play Hamlet. All right, let's go to number 8 if we can. Oh, that's the end of the observations. I'm going to go and talk about drawing some conclusions from the observations. Question: does this prove plagiarism? Does this prove that Joseph Smith plagiarized Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon? If it were word for word from Hamlet, it would be obvious evidence of plagiarism. But because it is only a similar idea using some similar words, it does not prove this passage was lifted from Shakespeare. The apologist would argue the similarity between Lehi and Hamlet is merely a coincidence. And they may be right. These types of coincidences happen all the time, especially when comparing a large volume like the Book of Mormon. It's over 500 pages. It's got tons and tons of chapters, tons of passages, tons of sermons, tons of everything in it. And you're comparing that large volume with another large body of work, which is the entire corpus of the plays of William Shakespeare. The bigger the sample size that you're drawing from, the more likely it is you're going to find a connection, especially when the connections you're looking for is from another sample size that is very, very large. The surprise would be if you didn't find any connections between the two. And the larger they are, the more likely it is that you will find connections, especially if you're motivated to do so. But what would happen if, and this is where I'm going to segue from talking about Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon to talking about how it is that this can be used as an example of that new methodology to undermine the entire field of apologetics, arguing that similarities in extra-biblical texts support the Book of Mormon as an ancient and correct historical record. In other words, proving the Book of Mormon is true, as apologists are wont to do. But what would happen if the passage from Hamlet were not in Hamlet? So I'm asking you to imagine this with me. Imagine that this passage is not in Hamlet, got dropped out, never appeared in it, but instead it were found, same passage that's in Hamlet, not in Hamlet, but it's found in an ancient text to which Joseph Smith had no access at the time. It was buried under the sands of Egypt or wherever, discovered after Joseph Smith dies, and it's got the same passage in it that is in Hamlet, okay? Then, if that happened, I can tell you with 100% certainty, then the attitude of the apologist about this passage and the connection with the Book of Mormon would be completely reversed. Then the similarity in the two passages would not be merely a coincidence to the apologist, but it would then instead be used as evidence that the Book of Mormon is true. They would say, how could Joseph Smith have known? This realization gives away the apologist's game of seeking to use similar phrases and concepts from ancient texts as proof of the Book of Mormon. All right. I've tried very hard and spent a lot of time trying to make this really clear. We'll see how I succeed, or if I succeed at all. Let me know in the comments, would you? This is the heads I win, tails you lose game of the apologists. Number 1, heads I win, tails you lose. This is the game the apologists are playing. And when we can see it, we can see more. Number 1, there are hundreds of similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts that were available to Joseph Smith. This is one example, right? This is a similarity between the Book of Mormon and Shakespeare. Shakespeare was available to Joseph Smith. 2, there are also hundreds of similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts that were not available to Joseph Smith. The game of the apologist is to call similarities in the first category, the one with texts that were available to Joseph Smith, like Shakespeare. The game of the apologist is to call similarities in that first category coincidence, and to call similarities in the second category proof. The second category being the similarities that are found between the Book of Mormon and texts that were not available to Joseph Smith. Meanwhile, critics often fall into the same trap. This is an important point. Meanwhile, critics, not the apologists, the critics often fall into the same trap in reverse, calling similarities in the first category proof. So the first category, once again, being similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did have access, such as Shakespeare, and calling that proof that Joseph Smith was influenced or plagiarized, which I don't believe, Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon. And it shouldn't be showing up there, except for the fact that Joseph Smith was influenced by Shakespeare when he dictated the Book of Mormon. So, meanwhile, critics often fall into the same trap in reverse, calling similarities in the first category proof and calling similarities in the second category coincidence. And once again, that second category is the hundreds of similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access. So, whereas the apologists tend to call the first category coincidence, similarities in the first category coincidence, and to call similarities in the second category proof that the Book of Mormon is true, critics often fall into the same trap in reverse, calling similarities in the first category proof that the Book of Mormon was influenced by contemporary documents, and calling any similarities in the second category between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access, calling those similarities coincidence. See, it's just the flip side of the same coin that's being played here by the apologists as well as the critics. I asked the question, is there cherry picking going on both sides? Sometimes there is. Objectively speaking, if one set of similarities, and this is important, and this is where I'm trying to make this clear. Objectively speaking, if one set of similarities is considered coincidence, so should the other set of similarities. In other words, if similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access are coincidence, then similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph did have access should also be considered coincidence, unless there is a very, very convincing, persuasive, and rational basis for distinguishing between the two, which as a general rule, there are not. There could be some exceptions. I'm not saying this is an absolute generalization forever, because generalizations are seldom wise. However, this is a very, very important point that I think that I'm making here. Conversely, if similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access are evidence of dependency, that would be the apologist position, right? Then similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph did have access should also be considered evidence of dependency. If one set of similarities is coincidence, there's no rational basis for saying that the other set of similarities are not coincidence. And if one set of similarities are argued as being dependent, then there's no rational basis for saying that the other set of arguments are not dependent. So what I'm saying here is that if an apologist says that the connection with Shakespeare is a coincidence, or any connections or similarities in the Book of Mormon to contemporary documents to Joseph Smith is a coincidence, then they are methodologically and logically bound to the proposition that any connections or similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access are also coincidence. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Similarly and conversely, if the apologist argues that similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access, show proof or evidence for the Book of Mormon, it shows dependency on those other texts, then there is no rational basis to say that the similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did have access are not also dependent. So what I'm saying is, if you want to have one set of similarities be coincidence and the other set of similarities be evidence, okay, now you're just cherry picking. And it's a flagrant attempt at cherry picking. And that's the part that I want to be clear on. The only basis on which you're making the distinction as an apologist, sometimes as a critic, is whether Joseph Smith had access to those documents or whether he didn't have access to those documents. That has nothing to do with whether it's coincidence or whether it's evidence. That's the main point I'm trying to drive home here. And I have another slide on this, which I'll go through. Absent strong and compelling reasons to treat them differently, apologists cannot rationally call it evidence when similarities occur between the Book of Mormon and texts unknown to Joseph Smith, while at the same time calling it coincidence when similarities occur between the Book of Mormon and texts that were known to Joseph Smith. When looked at this way, we can see how obvious and flagrant the cherry picking is by apologists. And we can immediately then see how flawed their methodology is when they argue that the same similarities are evidence if in texts unknown to Joseph Smith, but only coincidence if in texts that were known to Joseph Smith. Now, using our example, the one from Shakespeare, right? If the apologist insists that this line, reminiscent of Hamlet, appearing in the Book of Mormon is a coincidence, then consistency dictates that it be a coincidence regardless of whether Joseph Smith had access to it. That's what makes it a coincidence. On the other hand, if the critic insists that this line reminiscent of Hamlet appearing in the Book of Mormon is evidence of dependency, i.e., it really is paraphrased from Hamlet, then consistency dictates that it be evidence of dependency regardless of whether Joseph Smith had access to it. All right, let's go on from there. I hope I'm making this clear enough. As I say, Bill Reel and I will be devoting an entire Mormonism Live, at least one, and I may be devoting some more episodes to this in the future to try and clarify this particular methodology and this particular line of argumentation, which I think is devastating to the Mormon apologists who are trying to prove the Book of Mormon true by looking at similarities between it and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access. Conclusion. Ironically, then, the best argument the critic can make, if I'm right about this, the best argument the critic can make may be to agree that regardless of the similarities, the Book of Mormon is not quoting Shakespeare, and to agree with the apologist that it is merely a coincidence. And the same for any other similarities in the Book of Mormon to texts that Joseph Smith theoretically had access to. Why? Because in doing so, you remove from the apologist the ability to rationally argue that such similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access are evidence of dependency. And what I'm saying here, if it's not clear already, is that by agreeing that, say, this Hamlet quote in the Book of Mormon is a coincidence, if the critic agrees with the apologist on that issue, then it makes it so the apologist cannot rationally argue that any other similarities between the Book of Mormon and texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access are evidence. If the one is a coincidence, the other is a coincidence, right? So the apologist can concede that Hamlet in the Book of Mormon is a coincidence, or anything else in the Book of Mormon is a coincidence, which completely undermines the apologist's ability to claim that it's evidence when ancient texts to which Joseph Smith did not have access show up, or similarities to those ideas show up in the Book of Mormon. That's the idea. Conclusion number 3. This line of argumentation may be the silver bullet to the entire apologetic field of proving the Book of Mormon or other Mormon scripture true by finding similar ideas in extra biblical texts. The reason this is important at this juncture is because this very type of argument is once more raising its head among contemporary Mormon apologists, particularly Jonah Barnes, who has written an entire book on the subject. And there's that book. The Key to the Keystone is the title of his book, How Apocryphal Texts Unlock the Book of Mormon's Brass Plates. And frankly, it is the title of that book that lent itself to the title of my episode, which once again is Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon? And the subtitle of my episode being The Key to Unlocking Book of Mormon Apologetics. Jonah Barnes has been making the rounds on all sorts of different podcasts talking about the incredible discoveries he's been making and the similarities he's found in apocryphal literature and the Book of Mormon. That's why this is important, especially at this time, right now, when this type of argument is once again being promoted as proof positive that the Book of Mormon is true, when it is anything but evidence of that fact. All right, then, more to come. This is a brief introduction to this silver bullet methodology, and I may call it that, the silver bullet methodology of undermining. I mean, if Jacob Hansen can call his stuff, what is it, the collective witness model, I can call this the silver bullet methodology of undermining. Maybe I'll call it the silver bullet model. Jacob Hansen has the collective witness model. I'll have the silver bullet model. Yeah. So this is a brief introduction to the silver bullet methodology of undermining and rendering meaningless the apologist's efforts to prove the Book of Mormon true by appealing to similar ideas in extra biblical texts unknown to Joseph Smith. There's much more that could be said, and Bill Reel and I are planning on devoting an entire Mormonism Live, as I said at the top, an entire Mormonism Live episode to this discussion in the near future. So please stay tuned. Well, that is about all for tonight. Thank you for joining me. I hope you have found this interesting. I hope you find it as exciting as I do. And once again, please let me know if you understand what it is that I am trying to say in the comments below. The reason I'm so concerned about it is because I broached this with Bill Reel by phone last week, and we had at least an hour-long discussion where I was struggling to come up with words to explain to Bill what it was that I meant. And it took that long for him to understand what I was trying to convey. The fault was mine. I had been working on it. We worked on it together. He's very excited about it. Once it clicked for him, he was very, very excited about this idea. And that's why we want to do a Mormonism Live episode about it. But once again, this is the introductory episode to this idea, using Shakespeare in the Book of Mormon as a case in point, as an example that can be used to illustrate this new silver bullet methodology against Mormon apologetics. So once again, please hit like, please hit subscribe, and thank you to all my wonderful listeners, and especially those who have gone the extra mile and gone to radiofreemormon.org, click the donate button, and made a donation. Those donations are deductible in the United States. I do appreciate it so much. Your donations keep Radio Free Mormon broadcasting behind enemy lines. Well, as I said, that's about all for tonight. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.